They said Ruby Tyson was nothing special, just her husband's charity project, a shadow behind a successful man. But when the world turned its back, when everyone looked down on her, Ruby did not break. She rose, and with every stitch, every thread, she mended her own life. This is the story of a woman who never sought revenge. She only chose to shine brighter than anyone who had ever hurt her. Seattle, December. The rain fell like the sky was working overtime, refusing to rest. The soaked streets reflected the red glow of a 24-hour diner sign, where Ruby Tyson cleared the last table of her shift. She wore a faded beige uniform, a wet rag in hand, the smell of grease and burnt coffee seeping through the air. Her hands trembled not from the cold, but from exhaustion. 3 jobs a day, this wasn't living, it was surviving. But Ruby had a reason. David Call. David is a poor philosophy student at the University of Washington. When Ruby first met him, he was sitting in the corner of the diner, buried in a book so thick no one else would dare open it. He drank the cheapest coffee, black and bitter, but when he looked up and smiled, that smile was enough to brighten the whole room. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked when Ruby brought his coffee. Ruby smiled softly. "I believe in night shifts and tips." They both laughed. That's how it began, quietly, without drama, just 2 young souls finding each other in the rain of Seattle. David dreamed big. He talked about changing the world, writing books, and becoming a man whose voice mattered. Ruby listened, eyes shining, believing every word. She saw in him what she lacked, hope, and he saw in her what he'd never known, stability. So the long nights at the diner turned into dates. The mornings in the library became promises, and one spring afternoon, David took her hand in the park and said, "You're my foundation. When I make it, I'll bring you up with me." Ruby believed him, believed the way people believe the Seattle rain will one day stop. From then on, she began a journey only lovers dare to take, working extra shifts, sacrificing, whispering to herself, "It's just temporary." She worked at Emerald Diner by day, a warehouse at night, and cleaned offices on weekends. Every dollar she could spare, she sent to David for books, tuition, rent. She even sold her grandmother's ring, the only thing of real value she owned, so he could buy his final set of textbooks. When he received it, David held her tightly. "You're my angel," he said, kissing her forehead. "One day, I'll give you everything you deserve." Ruby smiled, not knowing that sometimes everything means nothing at all. That night, she walked home late. Rain slapped against her face, cold and relentless, but a quiet fire still burned inside her. She thought of the small apartment they would share, the breakfasts by a sunlit window, the 2 of them against the world. She didn't know the world doesn't always fight fair. Ruby sat in the stands on David's graduation day, holding a bouquet of daisies. When he stepped on stage, he looked down and smiled. At that moment, she believed every sleepless night and every double shift had been worth it. After the ceremony, he hugged her and said, "We did it, Ruby. We." She wanted to believe in that we. But as the crowd congratulated David only, Ruby felt herself fading into the background. She told herself, "It's fine. This is his day." She didn't know that from then on, every day would be his day. The following summer, they moved to New York, the city David called the place to build an empire. For Ruby, it was where things began to unravel quietly, slowly, like a cup of coffee going cold. Their first apartment in Queens was small and old, but Ruby found it beautiful. She hung floral curtains, taped their photos to the fridge, and wrote on a note, "No matter how tired we get, we still have each other." David smiled, but his gaze no longer lingered the way it used to. His new job consumed him, emails, meetings, names Ruby didn't recognize. At night, he came home late. When she asked, "How was your day?" he only said, "Fine," then opened his laptop. The little apartment grew colder, not from lack of heat, but from the absence of warmth. Ruby still cooked, still waited, still believed that if she stayed patient, he would return to her, the her he once saw. Then one evening, David said, "The company's opening a Midtown branch. I might be promoted." Ruby lit up. "That's wonderful. I'll look for work nearby." He hesitated, Maybe it's better if you stay home. I need someone to manage things so I can focus. Manage things, what did that mean? Meals, laundry, schedules, social events, turning his life into something seamless so he could shine. Ruby nodded. If that's what you need. She didn't realize she'd just signed an invisible contract, the first that would strip her of living for herself. Every morning she woke before him, making coffee, ironing shirts, whispering, "You're going to do great." David smiled, kissed her cheek, a habit more than affection. In the afternoons, Ruby bought flowers to keep traces of herself in the apartment. But David no longer noticed. One day, he said, "This place feels a little cheap. I want something more sophisticated." She murmured, "I can redecorate." "No, I meant somewhere else." So they moved to Manhattan, a bright, glass-walled apartment with no scent of coffee or wildflowers. Ruby hung their wedding photo, but the wall was too broad and the frame was too small. It looked like a reminder. Their love was shrinking too. She learned to navigate parties, the women in designer dresses with razor-edged smiles. Someone asked what she did. Ruby answered, "I'm figuring out my next step." The woman smirked. "To the shopping mall?" David heard and laughed along. Ruby forced a smile, though she felt her heart quietly being unstitched. That night, while he slept, she looked at him for a long time. The man who once trembled holding his diploma now slept soundly in a room she no longer belonged to. She touched his hand, her didn't stir, and she couldn't sleep. Because Ruby Tyson had started to dream again, not of them, but of finding herself once more. New York never slept, but Ruby only knew how to stay awake. Nights stretched long beneath yellow lights and the endless wail of car horns. From the 31st floor, she watched the city pulse below, its lights flowing like the veins of some enormous beast. This city lived on the heartbeat of those who never stopped, and David Call, her husband, was one of them. From the day he became branch director, David seemed to transform. He was busier, sharper, colder. His phone never stopped ringing, and every call seemed more important than anything she had to say. In the mornings, he wore his grey suits and perfectly knotted ties, leaving before the sun even rose. At night, he returned late, carrying the smell of whiskey, smoke, and expensive perfume from parties. Ruby waited for him. The dinner was cold, and the soft lamplight was her only company. Once, she asked quietly, "Would you like me to work? I'm not good at staying home all day." David didn't look up. "You already have a job. Keep things stable." "Stable for who?" He smiled. "For me. For us. Us." The word echoed again, but now it sounded different. She remembered when he was still the poor student who held her hand in that little diner and said, "I don't need the world, only your faith in me." Now it seemed he needed the whole world and had forgotten who believed in him first. The high society parties soon became part of their routine. Before her first one, Ruby stood in front of the mirror for hours, trying to look right. She chose a simple, graceful, pale pink dress she'd sewn herself. But the moment she stepped into the ballroom, the stares made her wish she hadn't come. An older woman, Patricia Call, David's mother, approached, her smile thin as a blade. "Oh, there's my daughter-in-law. I was told you had no sense of fashion. How adorable." Ruby smiled softly, said nothing. David raised an eyebrow. "Mother, please." But his tone carried no weight, as if he feared both her and the people watching. That night, Ruby felt invisible. They talked about stocks, projects, private schools, things she knew nothing about. When she mentioned wanting to study fashion design again, someone laughed. "Well, at least you'll have something to do while your husband succeeds." Laughter rang out, mingling with the clinking of glasses. David didn't look at her. On the drive home, Ruby stayed silent. "Are you upset?" David asked calmly. "I just didn't feel like I belonged there." "You're too sensitive." They were only joking. Ruby turned to the window. Rain streaked down the glass, and in its reflection, she barely recognized the woman looking back. The girl who once laughed freely in a rainy Seattle diner, now just a blurred shadow. The next day, David handed her a credit card. "I want you to buy a few new things. Something that fits my circle." She looked at the card, then at him. "Your circle?" He smiled and kissed her forehead. "You understand." And so Ruby learned. She learned how to smile at strangers, stand beside him without making him uncomfortable, laugh at the right moments, and stay silent in the right places. Every gesture and word was adjusted, as David gently suggested. Speak less. Don't talk about your past. Just smile, don't react. She didn't realize that a piece of her was quietly being taken away with each suggestion, until one day she looked in the mirror and saw a beautiful, elegant, flawless woman, someone she no longer knew. Ruby went to David's office one June evening to return the phone he'd forgotten at home. She waited in the lobby, glancing up at the glowing logo on the wall. Call Group Holdings. His name bright, cold, and nowhere was there room for hers. When the elevator doors opened, she heard laughter. David stepped out with several colleagues, a young blonde woman, in a tight dress, her hand resting on his shoulder. Ruby stood there, silent. David hesitated, then smiled. "Ruby, you're here? You left your phone," she said softly, handing it to him. "Thanks. You should head home. I've got things to finish with the team." "With the team?" Her eyes flicked toward the woman beside him. David lowered his voice. "Don't make a scene here." The words were quiet, but they slapped harder than any shout could. That night, he came home late and said nothing. Ruby lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain tapping the window pane. She thought of Seattle, where she once dreamed of New York as the land of their future, now that the future was burying her, inch by inch. The next morning, she rose early and made breakfast as usual. When David came out of the bedroom, she asked softly, "Do you remember what we used to be?" He frowned. "Not this again." "No. I just asked if you ever remember." He didn't answer. He only checked his watch, grabbed his briefcase, and said, "I'm late." The door closed. The apartment fell so silent she could hear the clock ticking. She poured coffee and took a sip. It tasted more bitter than ever. She looked around polished floors, a leather sofa, and white curtains. Everything luxurious, yet nothing hers. There is no scent of baked bread, daisies, or laughter in a tiny kitchen. She thought of another Ruby, the girl who once ran through the rain with small but honest dreams. Now, who was this woman in the mirror? A CEO's wife? Or just someone holding a place for a man too busy to love? That night, David brought home a box. "I got you something." Inside was an expensive dress, with a note, "For tomorrow's dinner with the board." She asked, "Do I have to go too?" "Of course. You're my wife." She smiled faintly. "You want me there so you look perfect." He didn't deny it. Ruby understood then. She was no longer the woman he loved. She was his backdrop. That night, she stepped onto the balcony, the wind cutting cold. Below, the city gleamed, buildings sparkling like diamonds. Once, she thought that light was a dream. Now she knew it only blinds. And in that moment, Ruby realized, sometimes, one person's success is another's hell. That morning, Ruby stood before the mirror, fastening the last button on her dress. It was an emerald green dress, not designer, but one she had sewn herself, every stitch done by hand. She'd stayed up late finishing it, hoping that at the luncheon at Call Estate today, people would see she was trying to fit in. Outside, the New York sky was clear and bright. No rain like in Seattle, but Ruby felt damp inside. David stepped out of the bedroom, red tie, crisp white shirt. He glanced at her briefly, then frowned. "You're wearing that." Ruby smiled nervously. "You don't think it's nice?" "I made it for today." He paused. "It's fine, but maybe you should go ahead first. Don't let my mother see us arrive together. She might say something." "You're embarrassed by me?" "It's not that. I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Ruby repeated the word in her head. "When you love the wrong person, your existence could become troubled." Call Estate stood in the Connecticut countryside, its iron gates opening between rows of red maples. Ruby sat in the car, watching the white mansion appear, each step polished with pride and privilege. Patricia Call waited by the door, a glass of wine in hand. "Oh, Ruby, you made it at last." Her voice was sweet, her eyes cold. "Hello, Mother. You're late. I hope you didn't drive yourself. These roads can ruin inexpensive cars." The luncheon began: white tablecloths, crystal glasses, Everything perfect except for Ruby. She felt every glance sweep over her, weighing, judging, then smiling politely. The women in elegant dresses spoke of vacations, private schools, and the issue of class differences in marriage. A blonde woman turned toward Ruby with a polite smile. "You're Ruby, aren't you? I heard you used to work at a diner. That's wonderful. I've always admired people who come from nothing." Her voice lingered on dinner like a reminder. Ruby forced a small smile. "Yes, I've done many jobs. I don't think honest work is shameful." "Oh, of course not. But it's interesting to see someone like you here." Laughter rippled around the table, soft and poisonous. Ruby looked down, her hand tightening around her glass. She glanced toward David. He was deep in conversation with his partners, smiling, not once turning her way. She wanted him to look at her just once, so he might see she was sinking. But he didn't. Someone said, "David, you're lucky. Not everyone dares to marry outside the circle." David gave a thin smile. "I've always liked being different." The table laughed again. It sounded like a compliment, but to Ruby, it was a knife wrapped in charm. She swallowed hard, her throat burning with wine and humiliation. She stood, murmured an excuse, and slipped out of the hall. In the empty corridor, she pressed her palm to the wall. In the restroom mirror, she saw herself beautiful dress, perfect hair, a fixed smile, but her eyes, hollow. A woman who once worked 3 jobs so her husband could graduate is now not considered worthy to sit at his table. She took a breath, washed her face, and went back out. She had learned not to make anyone lose face. That was the only lesson this house ever taught her. Never embarrass him. That evening, on the drive back to New York, silence filled the car. Ruby watched the streetlights streak past, fading like blurred memories. David was still texting. Finally, she asked softly, "How do you think today went?" "Fine. Don't mind them, you're too sensitive. You laughed when they insulted me. I was just keeping the peace." Keeping the peace? By letting them humiliate me? David set his phone down, his voice sharpening. "Ruby, you always overreact. They were joking." "Joking? You think how they looked at me like I was the help was a joke? You're being irrational." "No, I'm being honest." The car stopped in front of their building. David got out first, not waiting for her. Ruby followed, her heels clicking heavily against the marble floor. In the elevator, it was just the two of them. Neither spoke. Ruby looked at his reflection in the mirrored wall, the man who once vowed never to let her cry. And she realized he never truly kept that promise. She'd just refused to see it. That night, Ruby didn't eat dinner. She sat by the window, watching Manhattan's lights blur. Inside her, something cracked not loudly, but enough to know something had died. The next morning, social media exploded with a photo from the luncheon. When the maid crashes the high society table, Ruby stared at it, her hands cold. She turned off her phone, but the image stayed burned in her mind. She sat in the living room, sunlight cutting across her face in thin golden lines. She waited for David, hoping he would say something, "I'm sorry," or "I'll make them take it down." But when he came home, he only said, "Don't bother with that nonsense online." "Nonsense to you," Ruby whispered, her voice rough. "You're torturing yourself." "No, they're torturing me. And you're letting them." David said nothing. He just sighed and opened his laptop. Ruby stood there, watching him, her tears falling silently. That night, she didn't try to hide her sobs anymore, and perhaps, for the first time in years, Ruby Tyson truly heard herself, the sound of a heart cracking open, then going quiet. That morning, Ruby woke early. She stood in the vast marble kitchen, cold under her bare feet, listening to the wind slip through the glass panes. Today was Maxwell Call's birthday, David's father. Ruby wanted to prepare the party as she used to when they were still poor. She chose his favorite chocolate cake, with a touch of orange and rum, rich but soft. The kitchen filled with the smell of flour and butter, the scent of warmth that reminded her of Seattle, of the tiny kitchen where David once laughed and said, "You make the best cake in the world." He hadn't said that in a long time. When Ruby placed the finished cake on the table, David walked in white shirt, black tie, every line of his face polished to perfection. "You're still doing this yourself?" he asked, half annoyed. "Yes. I thought your father would like it. Next time, just order it. No need to make a scene. You don't have to prove anything." Ruby smiled faintly. "It's not about proving. I just wanted to make it with my own hands." She didn't know this would be the last cake she'd ever bake in that house. By evening, Call Estate glowed like a palace. Luxury cars lined the driveway, guests in tuxedos and gowns, perfume blending with the scent of money and power. Ruby wore a white dress, David's choice, not hers. "Don't draw attention," he said before leaving the car. "Just smile. I understand." She always did. But he never understood her. The party began with jazz music, clinking glasses, and empty praise words. Ruby walked beside David, keeping her polite smile in place. Then Patricia Call appeared, her arm linked with her son's, eyes sweeping over Ruby. "Oh, Ruby, you baked a cake?" "Yes, I did. I thought Father would enjoy it." Patricia raised an eyebrow, smiling faintly. "How touching. I didn't realize you still had domestic hobbies." Ruby said nothing. When the cake was brought out, lights glimmered and murmurs spread. A guest exclaimed, "It's beautiful." "Ruby, which bakery did you order from?" "I made it myself," Ruby said quietly. The table paused. Then laughter rippled through the room. An older woman chuckled. "Really? It looks so professional. Surely the CEO doesn't let his wife in the kitchen." Laughter again. David said nothing. Patricia smiled, her tone smooth and sharp. "I'm sure she's exaggerating. An amateur can't make a cake like that, but it's sweet that you tried." All eyes turned to Ruby. She stood in the center of the glittering room, watching the cake, once a symbol of love, being sliced and passed around, each piece served with a side of mockery. She looked at David. He was still smiling. A flawless, hollow, social smile. No defense. No glance of solidarity. Ruby felt her chest tighten. She wanted to leave, but remembered his words, "Don't cause a scene." So she stood still and swallowed every look, every laugh. When the party ended, she said softly, "Did you know I spent 3 days making that cake?" David opened the car door, not turning around. "So you thought people would believe that? That's not how things work in this world." Ruby said nothing. "This world," he said, as if she were some outsider, someone who didn't belong. That night, back home, Ruby walked straight to their room, removed her earrings, her dress, and sat on the edge of the bed. David stood before the mirror, loosening his tie. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said evenly, "for telling the truth, for not having tact. When they laugh, you should laugh too. They insulted me." "Ruby, stop arguing. You made me look bad." "And you," she said, lifting her gaze, fire in her eyes, "you've made me disappear." David turned, his face blank. "Enough. I don't want to talk about this. You'll sleep in the guest room until you learn how to behave." The room fell silent. Ruby looked at him for a long moment, then whispered, "All right." Just one word, soft as breath, heavy as an ending. The bedroom door closed. Ruby stood in the dark hallway. She didn't cry. She wasn't angry. Just empty. She walked to the living room, where streetlights cast faint patterns across the marble floor. A small piece of cake she'd brought home sat on the table, though she didn't know why. Ruby sat down, cut a slice, and ate slowly. The taste was bittersweet, just like their love. She looked around the apartment. Abstract paintings, crystal vases, Italian leather chairs. Nothing here carried her imprint. No photographs of the two of them. No chipped coffee mug. Only silence. And the whisper of rain against the glass. Ruby stepped onto the balcony. The city below shimmered traffic, lights, sirens, a world that knew nothing about the woman who'd just been exiled from her own bed. She thought of the years behind her, the nights she stayed awake working to pay for his education, the cheap meals they shared, dreaming of better days. She had once been the foundation he swore by. Now she was just someone he wanted to hide. Ruby sank into a chair, hugging her knees, staring into the night. Inside, the clock struck 2 a.m. Each tick sounded like a reminder. Her time in this marriage was over. When dawn broke, pale light spilled through the curtains. Ruby rose, picked up her phone and opened the browser. She typed, "Divorce attorney near me," Her fingers trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. A name appeared: Laura Chen, family law specialist. Ruby tapped call. A calm female voice answered, "Hello, law office of Laura Chen. How can I help you?" Ruby drew a deep breath. I want to make an appointment. I need advice on filing for divorce." A pause. Then the woman's gentle voice, "I understand. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" "Yes." Ruby ended the call and set the phone on the table. She looked out the window, dawn spreading across Manhattan, a soft pink glow washing over the skyline. For the first time in years, Ruby felt lighter. Not because the pain was gone, but because she had chosen to stop. She whispered, barely audible, "Enough, Ruby." And as the morning light touched her face, the woman who had once been erased from her own story finally began to awaken. The morning after that night, Ruby woke late. No sound of David, no scent of coffee, no hurried footsteps down the hall. Only the air conditioner's steady hum and pale light seeped through the curtains, spilling like mist across the carpet. The living room where she'd been told to sleep felt strange now. A thin blanket lay cold on the sofa. Beside it, a small suitcase she'd pulled from the closet. Ruby stared at it for a while, then chuckled. "Sleep in the living room until you apologize." David's voice echoed in her mind, like the command of a petty king. She wasn't angry anymore. She felt empty but clear. She wasn't trying to understand his feelings for the first time in years. She was thinking about her own, about the years she had lived, or instead, she had vanished. Ruby stood and pulled open the curtains. Light washed over her face, revealing dark circles beneath her eyes and a few loose strands of hair. She saw herself in the glass, tired, but real. No glittering gown, no practiced smile, just Ruby, the bare, unvarnished version of herself. Her phone buzzed. A message from Patricia. "I heard you were sent to the living room. If you want things to calm down, talk to me." A woman needs to know when to bend to keep her husband. Ruby stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it. No reply. She brewed a cup of coffee, the cheap kind she used to drink in Seattle, bitter and pungent. The first sip burned her throat, but cleared her mind. Then she opened her laptop and typed, "Divorce process, wife's rights in New York." The more she read, the faster her heart beat. Not from fear, from hope. She remembered the women who passed through the diner, tired but radiant, laughing through exhaustion. They had nothing, yet they were free. She had everything, yet couldn't breathe. Ruby picked up her phone by noon and called the law office again. "Good afternoon, law office of Laura Chen," said the receptionist. "This is Ruby Tyson. I had an appointment tomorrow, but could I come earlier? We can see you at 2 this afternoon. I'll be there." She hung up and sat quietly. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. She looked around the room, modern art, leather sofa, flat-screen TV, all of it David's taste. Nothing here belonged to her, but one truth settled deep inside her: this isn't my home. She entered the main bedroom, opened the closet, and packed a few clothes and some jewelry, not for their worth, but for what they meant. The shirt he wore when he proposed, the bracelet she wore on their wedding day, a photo taken in Seattle. She placed them gently into the suitcase. That was all. When David came home, night had fallen. He saw the suitcase and asked, "Where are you going?" "To see a lawyer." He gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Don't be ridiculous, Ruby. I'm not. And I won't apologize. You've lost your mind. Do you even know what you're doing?" "For the first time in my life," she said softly, "I think I do." She walked to the door. "Ruby," he called after her. She turned, calm, tearless. "You told me to sleep in the living room until I learned how to behave. I've learned to behave with myself first." The door closed, and that was the last time Ruby left that apartment, not as a wife, but as a woman reborn. That afternoon, gray clouds hung low over New York. Ruby climbed the stairs of an old building on Canal Street and stepped into a modest office with frosted glass that read, "Laura Chen, family law attorney." Laura, an Asian-American woman in her 40s, greeted her with a calm, kind smile. "Hello, Ruby. Please, have a seat." Her voice carried the quiet strength of someone who had spoken those words to countless women reclaiming their lives. Ruby sat, fingers interlaced. I don't know where to start. Start with what made you want to leave, Laura said, pouring water. Ruby gave a weary smile. I think I left a long time ago. Last night was just the first time I walked out the door. Laura nodded slowly. What do you want after the divorce? Ruby was silent, and then spoke, each word deliberate. Freedom. I don't want his money. I want my name back. Laura smiled gently, her eyes bright with admiration. That's the best answer I've heard today. They began the paperwork. As Ruby signed the first form, her hand trembled, and tears slipped onto the edge of the page. Laura quietly slid a box of tissues toward her. Crying isn't weakness, she said softly. It's proof you're alive again. Ruby nodded. When it was done, she stood and looked out the window. Rain had started to fall, soft, cleansing. Not Seattle's cold, heavy rain, but a thin, silvery drizzle, like a breath, washing the old pain away. That evening, Ruby rented a small room in Queens. Just a single bed, a tiny window, overlooking flickering neon signs, the distant sound of trucks. She unpacked, changed into her pajamas, and made herself a cup of tea. No luxury, no quiet elegance, but it was hers. She lay on the bed, listening to the rain tapping the tin roof. She thought of Seattle, those early days of love in the rain. But now, the rain no longer made her sad. It reminded her she had survived it once, and she would again. Before sleep, Ruby opened her phone and wrote a note. If tomorrow I feel weak, remind me that I was once brave. She smiled, closed her eyes. Outside, the rain stopped, and in that small, dim room, a woman began again from nothing, but with a soul entirely her own. That morning, Ruby woke to trucks rumbling past the narrow street below. The small room in Queens was flooded with sunlight. For the first time in years, morning light touched her face, revealing tired eyes swollen from sleeplessness and a soft, quiet smile. She made herself a cup of instant coffee. The bitter scent filled the room. There was no one to serve, no sound of David's hurried steps, no expensive clock ticking on the wall. Only her, just her and the sweetest silence she had ever known. Ruby sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the divorce papers Laura had emailed. Black ink on white paper. In the top corner was her name, Ruby Tyson Call. The word call clung to her name like an ink stain, a mark of something that had once belonged to her, but no longer did. She picked up the pen. Its tip hovered above the paper, trembling slightly. Laura's calm voice came to mind. There's no rush. Sign only when you're truly ready. Ruby drew a deep breath. She remembered Seattle, the long shifts, the exhaustion, how she'd worked so David could study. She remembered the nights in that diner, when he said, I'll give you everything. She remembered the way he looked at her the day he graduated. Then the parties, the insults, the words, you'll sleep in the living room until you learn how to behave. Everything flooded back, and then grew quiet. She smiled faintly and whispered, I've learned, David. Then Ruby signed, a thin, decisive line. The paper trembled once, then lay still. Laura smiled. Congratulations, Ruby. You just signed your freedom. Ruby smiled through her tears. Thank you. I think I needed this more than anything. Outside the courthouse, the sun blazed bright. A gust of wind lifted her hair, carrying the smell of pastries from a bakery across the street. Ruby stood on the sidewalk, breathing deeply. No one would ever call her by her husband's name again. No one would tell her how to act, speak, or be. There was only the wind, the light, and the rhythm of her heartbeat. Her phone buzzed. A message from David. You'll regret this, Ruby. She stared at the screen, then typed back. No, I won't. Just 2 words, the strongest she had ever written. Ruby turned into a small cafe on the corner. She ordered an egg sandwich and black coffee. The waiter smiled. Nice day, huh? Ruby nodded. Yes, the nicest in years. The cheap breakfast tasted better than any banquet she'd ever attended. As she ate, she wrote in her small notebook, I haven't lost anything. I'm just picking myself back up. When she stood, she caught sight of herself in a mirror near the door. The woman looking back had bright eyes, no longer tired, no red lipstick, no designer dress, just a genuine smile and hands ready to hold something new. That afternoon, Ruby returned to her room. She tidied a small corner by the window, spread a white cloth, placed her notebook, a vase of wildflowers, and a cup of cold coffee. Not elegant but alive. She looked at the tiny space and felt a quiet warmth. Her phone rang. It was Laura. "Just checking in," Laura said. "Are you all right?" "Better than I expected." "Good. I told you tears aren't a weakness. You've taken the first step." Ruby smiled. "The first step toward what?" "The rest of your life." After the call, Ruby went outside. The New York afternoon glowed gold. She walked across the Queensboro Bridge, the river wind tangling her hair. People passed by without a glance. No one saw her as Mrs. Call. And to Ruby, that was the most beautiful thing of all. She stopped when she passed a small bookstore with a faded sign reading, "Hiring part-time assistant." The wooden sign was worn, the letters almost gone, but something about it made her heart flutter. She pushed the door open. Inside smelled of paper and dust, the light warm and gentle. A gray-haired woman was arranging books. "Are you hiring?" Ruby asked. The woman looked up, smiling kindly. "Yes. Do you have any retail experience?" Ruby smiled back. "I have life experience." They both laughed. "What's your name?" "Ruby Tyson." "Tyson, nice name. Come in tomorrow, Ruby." When Ruby stepped back onto the street, her heart lifted. She had just found the first missing piece of her new life. She looked up at the sky, painted orange by sunset, and whispered, "Thank you, God. I can finally breathe." That night, Ruby wrote in her journal, "Day 1 of freedom. I have a job. I have myself. I no longer need to be someone else to be loved. I need to be Ruby, and that's enough." Before turning off the light, she laid a hand over her heart. It beat steadily, vigorously. The sound she hadn't heard clearly in years now played like the music of a new beginning. And in the darkness, Ruby smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because, for the first time in her life, she knew it would be. Early March in New York, the wind was still cold, but no longer sharp as needles. Ruby walked down a small street in Brooklyn toward her new job at Greenleaf Bookstore, a little bookstore. The wooden door chimed as she pushed it open. Inside was another world. The smell of old paper, soft amber light, brown painted bookshelves, and at the far end of the counter, Maxine Green, the silver-haired woman she'd met the day before. "Good morning, Ruby," Maxine said, her voice deep and warm like jazz. "Good morning, Miss Maxine. I came early today." "People who start over always come early. There's a lot to learn." They both laughed. Ruby began her first morning dusting books, labeling prices, and rearranging old novels. The work was simple, no money, no status, but each time she placed a book on the shelf, she felt she was putting another piece of her life back where it belonged. Midday, Maxine brought out 2 cups of coffee. "You know," she said, "I divorced at 45. Ruby looked up, surprised. "Really?" "Yes. I lost everything, my house, my husband, my confidence. But then I opened this shop. It didn't just save me, it let me meet women like you, walking through that door." Ruby's throat tightened. Maxine smiled, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Ruby, you don't have to be strong right away. It's all right to be fragile. Never return to the place that made you forget who you are." Those words lit a small fire inside her. Ruby felt warmth spread through her chest for the first time in months. That evening, after the last customer left, she helped Maxine lock up. She looked at the small glowing sign outside and whispered, "I think I've found the first place that feels like mine in a long time." Maxine smiled. "Not a place, Ruby. You're finding yourself." That night, Ruby lay on her bed, a cup of tea in her hands, her heart filled with something unfamiliar. Not complete happiness, but hope. She wrote in her journal, "Day 27. I have a job. I met someone who believes in me, even when I don't. Maybe that's what healing looks like." 2 months later, Ruby had fallen into her new rhythm. In the mornings, she worked at the bookstore. At night, she took on sewing jobs, hemming skirts, and fixing torn seams for neighbors. Her old sewing machine, bought second-hand online, clattered like a heartbeat of freedom. One evening, Maxine stopped by with a canvas bag. "A young woman asked me to fix her wedding dress. she said. "I thought of you." Ruby opened the bag. A vintage white gown torn in places, stained with tea. "Do you really think I can fix this?" Ruby asked softly. "No one mends the past better than those who've been torn apart," Maxine said, then left her to it. Ruby stared at the dress for a long time. She touched the fabric cool and soft. Under the lamplight, each stitch glimmered like a thread of hope. She sewed through the night, music playing low. Memories surfaced: her wedding, her forced smile, David's cold hand. Each stitch felt like an act of forgiveness, not for him, but for herself. By morning, the dress was whole again. It shone in the sunlight, reborn. Ruby gazed at it and whispered, "Maybe I can sew my life back together, too." A week later, the young bride returned. She saw the dress and burst into tears. "It's beautiful. Thank you." Ruby smiled. "I wish you all the happiness in the world." "Do you believe in happiness?" the girl asked. Ruby's smile deepened, calm and knowing. "I do. Sometimes you have to make it yourself." Word spread through the neighborhood about a woman named Ruby Tyson, who sewed dresses with care and kindness. Orders began to grow. She created a social media account and posted her first design photo one day. Her shop's name, Tyson Atelier. Her caption read, "Every stitch is a story. Every tear can be mended." The next day, she had 5 followers. A week later, 50. Then a small local newspaper ran an article titled, "Local Designer Inspires Women to Start Over." Ruby read it at a cafe. The photo showed her bent over a dress, sunlight streaming through the window. Her quiet smile caught mid-thread. The first comment beneath it read, "Thank you. I'm starting over too. Your story gave me courage." Ruby set the phone down, her hands trembling. Tears slid down her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from the realization that she had done something she once thought impossible. That night, Maxine came by and pulled her into a long hug. "See, Ruby? No one rises from ashes without carrying light." Ruby laughed through her tears. "Do you think I'm strong, Maxine?" "No," she said softly. "You're honest, and that's real strength." After Maxine left, Ruby sat alone. She looked at her hands calloused from thread, needles, and life, but they no longer shook. She opened her journal and wrote, "Day 103. I have something with my name on it. Tyson Atelier. I don't need permission to exist. I need to believe I'm worthy." Outside, New York sparkled with light. The wind drifted through her window, carrying the scent of jasmine. Ruby smiled, whispering, "Thank you for sending me out of that room, David. If you hadn't, I'd never have stepped into this light." And so, in the very city that once swallowed her whole, Ruby Tyson, once called the woman who didn't belong, was quietly rebuilding herself, piece by piece, from the ashes. The headquarters of Call Industries towered over Midtown Manhattan, arrogant and cold, much like its master. David Call sat in the 42nd floor boardroom, facing the city but seeing nothing beyond the red numbers tumbling down the screens. 3 major contracts were cancelled. 2 senior executives resigned. An anonymous memo has now been circulated company-wide. The culture of fear inside Call Industries. "We're managing the situation," said Graham, his longtime partner's voice uncertain. David looked at him, eyes like ice. "Managing? 3 weeks ago, we led the market. Now our stock's down 18%. You call that control?" His voice sliced through the room. Graham fell silent. No one else dared meet his gaze. Once, David had been the symbol of brilliance, young, decisive, daring. Now, they saw only a man unraveling, brittle, hollow, dangerous. When the meeting ended, David stepped into the elevator. The mirrored walls reflected a face he barely recognized, exhausted, shadowed eyes, and what frightened him most, fear. That night, he returned home to the vast, sterile mansion. No greeting, no scent of dinner, no warm light in the kitchen. Just emptiness, his footsteps echoing through a house that no longer belonged to anyone. On the dining table lay an envelope. He opened it. A court document finalized divorce papers. In the corner, the name Ruby Tyson stood clear. No call, no attachment left. He sat down, hands trembling. He had once believed he'd feel free when she was gone. But all he felt now was a void, a black hole where something living used to be. He poured a drink, then another. Then another. The whiskey didn't warm him, it only sharpened the images flooding back. Ruby in the old diner, smiling as he spoke of dreams. Ruby is in their tiny apartment, mending his shirts. Ruby, in her yellow dress, eyes shining at his graduation. He remembered that he had loved her, and worse, he remembered that he was the one who killed that love. The next morning, the phone rang his mother. "David, I heard about the company. Come home, we need to talk." At the family estate, Patricia Call was still Patricia Call, poised, elegant, voice like a velvet blade. But that day, her eyes carried something unfamiliar, weariness and regret. "What's happening to you?" she asked. David poured himself coffee, not looking at her. "Nothing. Don't lie to me. The city's talking about how you treated Ruby." David smirked. "Ruby? She's the world's sweetheart now. Let her have it." Patricia set down her cup. "You think I can't see it? You're losing everything. And it started the day Ruby left." David looked up, eyes red. "You always hated her." "I was wrong." Those two words froze him. Patricia Call, who had never admitted fault to anyone, had just said, "I was wrong." "I thought Ruby wasn't worthy of you," she said softly. "I thought she made you weak. But I see now Ruby didn't weaken you. She grounded you. You were strong only because she was beside you." David exhaled shakily. "It's too late." "It's never too late," she said, "to become someone better." His father, Maxwell Call, entered then, his voice quiet, sorrowful. "I stayed out of your marriage because I thought it wasn't my place. But now I must say this. You didn't lose Ruby because she left. You lost her because you stopped seeing her." David said nothing. Maxwell continued, "You always believed you built this empire on your own. But Ruby was your foundation. And when you tore away the foundation, collapse was inevitable." The words struck like a hammer. David left the house and drove aimlessly through Manhattan until he stopped in front of a small studio, Tyson Atelier. The golden sign glowed in the evening light. Through the window, Ruby was there smiling, stitching a dress, talking to a customer, her face lit with quiet joy. The same smile she once had, but no longer for him. David stood outside, frozen. In his pocket, a half-written apology letter crumpled in his hand. He wanted to go in, to give it to her. But he couldn't. She was happy, whole and free, and that truth hurt more than any loss of wealth or power. He turned away. The cold wind swept the street, catching the letter as it slipped from his pocket. It fluttered once, then landed in the gutter. 4 shaky words in his handwriting. "I'm sorry, Ruby." A month later, Call Industries lost its most significant international partnership. Headlines screamed, "CEO David Call runs company through fear. Internal chaos erupts." Stocks crashed. The board voted him out. David resigned in silence, bound by the chains he had forged himself. He stepped out of the building into the crowd. No cameras, no praise. Just another man among thousands, swallowed by the same city he once believed he owned. He wandered, wind biting through his coat, and for the first time, he understood what Ruby must have felt all those years ago. Small, alone, unseen in the crowd, and for the first time, he didn't resent the feeling. He accepted it. That night, back in his empty house, he opened his laptop. A video appeared on the newsfeed. Phoenix Rising, the story of Ruby Tyson. He clicked play. Ruby stood on stage beneath a single spotlight, radiant. She said, "I once thought that if I lost the man I loved, I couldn't survive, but I was wrong. When you lose someone who no longer loves you, you are, in truth, reborn." David closed the laptop, tears streaking down his face, not just from regret but from understanding. She hadn't simply left him. She had escaped him, and now he would have to learn how to live in a world where he no longer controlled anyone, not even himself. He picked up a pen and wrote in his notebook, "If she can be reborn, so can I." Not to win her back, but to become someone worthy of remembering. And that night, in the city that had once been his kingdom, David Call, the fallen king, finally bowed to the truth. No empire built on the shadow of a broken woman can ever stand. It was an autumn night. David Call sat alone in an empty apartment, the amber light from a single lamp glinting off his glass of whiskey. He had sold the company, the cars, and even the penthouse that had once defined his success. Everything was gone except the echo of wind and the hollow quiet left behind. On the table lay a blank sheet of paper. Beside it was a worn Parker pen that Ruby had given him when he landed his first job in New York. He picked it up and began to write. "Ruby, you may never read this. I used to think writing was a weakness men didn't need to apologize, only to succeed and prove their worth. But today, looking back, I see nothing left to prove. I've lost everything, the company, my name, my friends, and when all that fell away, I realized the only thing I truly lost was you." David paused, eyes closed. Memories rose like ghosts. Ruby in the kitchen, sunlight in her hair. Ruby smiling as he spoke about his first project. Ruby's silent tears the night he left her for yet another business dinner. He kept writing. "I made you live in my world without ever trying to build one for us. I turned love into a tool, and you into evidence of my worth. I thought I was climbing higher, but only stood on your sacrifices. When you walked away, I told you you'd regret it. Now I know the only one who should." Rain began to fall outside, soft and steady, like the old Seattle nights. David stood and opened the window. Cold air swept in. His hand trembled as he wrote the final lines. "Ruby, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I hope, wherever you are, you're smiling for real this time. And if someone loves you the way you deserve, don't be afraid to love him back. I don't deserve that love anymore. But I know you do." When he finished, a drop fell onto the paper. He didn't know if it was rain or tears. He folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope. On the front, he wrote, "To Ruby Tyson, not to be sent." Then, he placed it beside an old photograph, two young lovers outside a diner, his arm around her shoulders, his promise still fresh. "I'll bring you up with me." Now, he was the one beneath, and she the one who had risen. A few weeks later, Ruby was at her studio, stitching a dress at Tyson Atelier. When the bell above the door chimed, she looked up, expecting a client. But when the door opened, David stood there, thinner, hair unkempt, eyes hollow but calm. "Hello, Ruby. No darling, no practiced charm. Just a quiet, sincere greeting." Ruby stared at him for a moment. No anger, no tremor, only peace. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness," he said softly. "Then what do you want?" He swallowed hard. "To say, thank you." She tilted her head slightly. "Thank you for leaving, Ruby. I might never have seen who I was if you hadn't." Silence filled the room. The sewing machine hummed, the needle gliding through fabric. Ruby finally said, "You're late, David, but at least you came." He nodded. Then, she placed the envelope on her work table, the same letter he had written on that rainy night. "I wrote this without meaning to send it, but maybe you should read it." Ruby looked at the envelope, then at him. After a pause, she nodded. "All right." He turned and left without looking back, because now, the most tremendous respect he could offer her was to walk away in silence. When the door closed, Ruby opened the letter. His handwriting still familiar, still careful. She read every line, her heart quiet. When she reached the words, "I just hope, wherever you are, you're smiling for real." She smiled, warm, bittersweet, and free. She folded the letter and placed it inside a small wooden box, beside her old wedding ring and a faded photograph, not to remember, but to close the chapter. That afternoon, sunlight spilled through the window, catching in her hair. Ruby finished the final stitch on a wedding gown, the needle glinting like dawn. She was no longer the girl erased by love, nor the woman defined by her pain. She was simply Ruby Tyson, a woman who had forgiven, not with words, but by living a life more beautiful than any apology could ever be. 3 years later, winter had just begun in New York, and snow drifted down the avenue like silver dust. Ruby Tyson stood before the mirror in the backstage room of the Plaza Hotel, dressed in a gown of silver blue she had designed herself. It wasn't made to dazzle. It was made to tell a story, each stitch a wound healed, each crystal a tear that had learned to shine. Tonight was the gala she had created, Phoenix Rising, a night for women who had been broken, for those learning to rise and love themselves again. Hundreds of guests, journalists, artists, and designers filled the ballroom. But Ruby wasn't overwhelmed. She had seen grander rooms before and learned that true light never comes from chandeliers, but from within. Maxine entered with the same gentle smile as ever. "Ready, Ruby?" Ruby nodded. "For the first time in my life, yes." "Remember," Maxine said softly, "tonight isn't about revenge, it's about fire." Ruby smiled. "I know. A queen doesn't need a throne. She only needs freedom." Music began. Ruby stepped onto the stage, bathed in soft white light. The room fell silent. In the front rows sat women of all ages, some scarred, some still healing, all sitting upright, heads high. Ruby took the microphone. Her voice was steady, low, and warm. "My name is Ruby Tyson. I used to be someone else, a woman who thought that to be loved, she had to become smaller." She paused, meeting their eyes. "But I've learned, love isn't about losing yourself to keep someone. It's about walking the same direction, not kneeling at their feet." The room was still, every breath held. Then she smiled. "I don't tell my story to relive the past, but to remind you, you can still return if you've been hurt. You don't need magic, you only need to believe you deserve better." Applause thundered through the hall. Cameras flashed. The light caught her face, calm, radiant, unafraid. And at that moment, a familiar figure appeared at the far end of the ballroom. David, dressed in a black suit, older now, weary, eyes deep and tired but no longer proud. He hadn't come to win her back. He had come to bow his head. After the ceremony, Ruby stepped off stage. David approached, stopping a few feet away. They faced each other, no bitterness, only two souls who had weathered the same storm. "Congratulations, Ruby," he said quietly. "Thank you for coming," she replied. He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." Ruby met his gaze, steady, clear. "You were right, David. I used to be small, but not anymore." He nodded, tears brightening his eyes. "I know, and I'm glad." He started to speak again, but Ruby lifted her hand gently. "No need. I forgave you long ago, not with words, but by living on." David smiled faintly and bowed his head. "You're a queen, Ruby. Always have been." She shook her head. "No, I'm just a woman who learned to stand up." He left without another word. The door closed behind him, and with it, the past. Ruby stood still for a moment, gazing around the glittering hall. A young woman from the program approached, taking Ruby's hand. "Miss Ruby, thank you. Your story made me believe I can live differently." Ruby smiled and squeezed her hand. "Don't just live differently. Live truthfully, for yourself." By dawn, Ruby stepped out of the hotel. New York was hushed beneath the pale gold of morning. The snow was melting, the streets glimmering. She walked toward the Queensboro Bridge, the same bridge she had crossed on her first morning of freedom. The wind was cold, but her heart was warm. Halfway across, she stopped, watching the river sparkle below. This city had once swallowed her whole, and now it had returned her to herself. Ruby pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket, David's old letter, yellowed with time. She read it one last time, then folded it again and released it into the river. The paper drifted, spun, and disappeared into the current. She whispered, "Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's freeing yourself." The sun broke through the clouds. Light poured over her hair, burning bright in her eyes. Ruby smiled, not because she had achieved everything, but because, at last, she felt enough. Her phone rang. Maxine's voice crackled through. "Ruby, your speech is all over the internet. Everyone's talking about you." Ruby laughed. "This time, not about my dresses, I hope." "No," Maxine said. "About your heart." Ruby looked out at the river, wind teasing her hair, and said softly, "A queen doesn't need a throne. She only needs freedom." Then she turned, walking into the morning light. In the distance, New York shimmered, brilliant, chaotic, alive. And in its heartbeat, among the rush of new beginnings, Ruby Tyson moved with quiet grace. No longer the woman left behind, but the woman who had found her way home to herself.